Shalom Aleichem. Those are beautiful words. Those are words that mean you're among friends, and moreover, that you're at home. And this is our home. This is the YIVO Institute is a home. It's a home for Shalom Aleichem. It's a home for Yiddish culture. It's a home for all those aspiring to discover their roots and their genealogies and the complexities of the fate of the Jewish people in the 20th century. It's my very special privilege as executive director of YIVO, Jonathan Brent, to introduce today's program. Before I do so, I want to note that we have a wonderful, wonderful exhibition of materials of Shalom Aleichem that include the family album that has been donated to YIVO recently by the family of Shalom Aleichem on the third floor in the Smart Gallery. After the proceedings, after the talks, I do invite all of you to go and see it. I think you will be thrilled. It is full of unexpected, wonderful materials, photographs, manuscripts, caricatures, newspaper articles, all kinds of things from the extraordinary YIVO archives. Before going too much further, I want to thank Ukrainian Jewish Encounters for their support of this program. I want to thank the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs for their support. And moreover, I want to thank the family of Shalom Aleichem in particular. And I would like to ask the members of the extended Shalom Aleichem family, please to stand up and be acknowledged. We are delighted that you're all here. Thank you so much. I also wish to acknowledge two of the trustees of the YIVO Institute, Ruth Levine, our co-chairman, and Irene Pletka. Without whom, needless to say, none of this would be possible. Today's speakers and performers are to be found in your program. I'm not going to read their bios for you. I do, however, wish to acknowledge one of our speakers in particular, who is normally known as one of the greatest concert pianists in the world today, Yevgeny Kissin. So without more ado, I would like to invite Shane Baker and Eleanor Reisa.
Shalom Aleichem, when describing the hero of his epistolary, that's written in the form of correspondence, novel, Menachem Mendel, says,
Menachem Mendel is nicht gewähnt kein Held von Roman, in übergehaupt nicht kein ausgeklärte Figur.
Menachem Mendel wasn't some made-up hero in a novel.
Das ist neber a Jid von a ganz Jahr, von welchen der Verfasser ist persönlich genuend bekannt. Ist durchgegangen mit dem a Stück Leben von kemat 20 Jahren.
He was, sad to say, a regular Jew, known personally to the author of these pages for almost 20 years.
Ausgestanden a Sachkrisen, sich gefahren mit dem von ein paar Nüsse auf der andere.
He made it through any number of crises, careered from career to career, with never a bit of luck.
Oi weh, nicht gefinnen kein Glück in Ehrgeiz. Gemisst sof kol sof teen dus, wo's alle Jiden teen. Emigrieren kann Amerika.
In the end, he had to do just like every Jew and emigrate to America.
Dorten sagt man, machen Jiden nicht schlecht.
There they say Jews do okay. Menachem Mendel is the quintessential Luftmensch,
And Schlemazel.
all rolled into one,
And his wife, Shana Shandel, a pragmatist.
with an acid tongue. But let's stop talking about them.
And let's let them talk for themselves.
I was just about to say that.
Yeah, but I did.
Yes, you did.
Yes, I did.
Very nice.
It doesn't matter who has the last word.
Now we'll go ahead and start, okay?
Okay, so
Okay.
start.
Very
So
good.
start.
Fin am ersten Bier,
That's right, start with that.
fin am ersten Bier, London, Odessa Börse.
From the first book, London, the Odessa Stock Exchange. Von Menachem Mendel zu sein Weib Shana Shandel in Kasrilivke.
Menachem Mendel writes to his wife, Shana Shandel.
That's me.
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
Mazel tov.
Don't worry.
In Paupersville. Lezegusi hayakura hatsniya muris Shana Shandel shetichye.
To my wife, the dear, honest, modest, worthy mistress, Shana Shandel, long may she live.
Reishes bin ich dir moidie, as ich bin Baruch Hashem baka v'chayim ve'ashulam.
Firstly, I wish to tell you that I am, thank the Lord, in good health.
Hashem Yisburach soll helfen, me soll tun mit horchen, eins von am anderen, nur geht's mit Psiris Teuves, Yeshias von Achumas umein.
May the Lord grant that we should always hear one from the other, only good news, amen.
Veheshene, sei wissen,
And secondly, you should know
als ich bin gut nicht imstand, dir zu beschreiben, die Stuart des, wie groß und schön sie ist, in die Menschen, die hege mit ihren Gitte-Charakteren.
I can't begin to describe Odessa, how big it is and how beautiful, and the people of Odessa have a wonderful character.
Translators note Odessa was renowned as a godless city of thieves and swindlers.
No offense to any Odessa swindlers who might be in the house this afternoon.
Die goldene Geschäften, was me kann du machen,
What wonderful business you can do here.
will ich handeln in Weiz, ist Weiz.
If you want to deal in wheat, they got wheat.
Klein ist klein.
Bran, they got bran.
Wool,
Wool,
Mehl,
flour,
Salz,
salt,
Feathers,
feathers, raisins,
Herring,
herring.
a Klau. Was am Meul kann ausreden, gefinnst du in dem Odess.
In short, if your mouth can say it, Odessa's got it.
Ich handel mit London, in verdien dabei gut nicht kusche.
I myself am dealing in London, and I have already made a pretty penny.
Dus London is als een mischer, wo's me kann dabei glücklich werden in ein Tag.
With this London business, you can really make a killing.
Ort is niet lang, rausgekommen a Herr einer, etwas a Schammes, und hat gehabt in ein Schmaies Royal 30.000.
Not long ago, the sexton came to town and bought some London, and in the time it took to say one Shema Yisroel, he made 30,000 clams. You should pardon the expression.
Ich sag dir, Segusi Hayakura, Mamisch, es walgert sich Gold du in de Gassen.
I'm telling you, dear wife, the streets here are literally littered with gold.
Chab Baruch Hashem, ken Charute nit, wo sich bin herupgefahren Herr Kenades.
I have, thank God, no regrets at all that I wound up here in Odessa.
Wirst du dich fragen, wie kem ich Kenades, als gefahren bin ich gar kein Kishinev?
Well, you might be asking yourself, how did I wind up in Odessa when really I was traveling to Kishinev?
Apunem as is beschert von Gott, ich soll verdienen grobe etliche Kehrblach.
Apparently, because God Himself wants me to make some plenty money.
Als ich bin gekommen ken Keshenev zum Vetter Salmen upnehmen dus Nadeninsel, sucht als ken me Simmen Geld hat jetzt nicht, kann mir geben an Unweisung zu Brodskin ken Jehupitz.
When I got to my uncle Zalman in Kishinev to pick up the wedding money that he was holding for us, he said he didn't have any cash at the moment, but he would give me an IOU to pick up money from Brodsky and Yehupitz.
So ich, lo sein ken Jehupitz abi Geld.
So I says, let it be Yehupitz as long as there's money.
Sogt weiß nicht, sie in Jehupitz sitzt du Geld. Aber kann mir geben an Unweisung zu Bachrachen ken Warsche.
So he said, well, he didn't know if there was money in Yehupitz, but he could give me a check to give to Bachrach in Warsaw.
So ich, lo sein ken Warsche abi Geld.
So I says, let it be Warsaw as long as there's money.
Sogt was trägt der Warsche? Warsche ist weit. Ob ich will, kann mir geben an Unweisung zu Barbaschen Canades.
So he says, what do you need, Warsaw? Warsaw is far. If I want, he can give me a check to give to Barbash in Odessa.
Bekitzer, als ich so Geld ist Geld.
In short, when I say money, I get money.
Geht und nimmt aus 2 Wechselach zu Tagkehrblach zu Barbaschen Canades.
So he writes me out 2 checks for $500 for me to cash by Barbash in Odessa.
In mach me sich hab kein Zeit nicht, mach ich es bekitzer.
Anyway, I'm very busy, so I'll cut it short.
Sei gesinnt in los grissen schweren Schwieger in de Kinderlach sollen leben.
Be well and give regards to my father and mother-in-law and to our dear little children.
Memeni Baalchu,
Your husband, Menachem Mendel.
Ike Schachachti.
P.S.
Als ich bin gekommen mit der Unweisung zu Barbaschen, sagt mir, als die Unweisung ist gar nicht keine Unweisung, als sigur als Sicherschär.
When I tried to cash the check with Barbash, he told me that it wasn't a check at all, but a ticket for a wild goose chase.
Los früher unkommen, suchen sie von einer fetten Salmen, der Waggon Weiz, in los men auch die Weiz verkaufen, wird man euch damals geben Geld.
First he says, let your Uncle Zalman send me the wagon of wheat that he owes me, and let us sell it all, and then I can give you the money.
Aber ich bald weggeschrieben zum fetten Salmen in Keshenev, an Ort Kritke, als Thomas schickt nicht daraus, take für mich ja die Weiz, weil ich ihm klappen mit der Pech.
So I sent Uncle Zalman a postcard that if he didn't send the wheat money out immediately, I'd be sending him a telegram.
In erst Nachten ist ungekommen von Keshenev, am Simmener hinderter in auf Reichkerblach aufwechseln. Sind verstehst du schon, verwusst ich hab dir früher nicht geschrieben.
Well, just yesterday, I finally got a letter from Kishinev with $100 cash and a check for 200 more, so you see why I didn't write you earlier.
Ich hab das ganze bisschen mit Simmons reingebracht in London rein, in Danken Hashem Yisburach, me sucht, als sie schon da rewig.
So I put all the money right into London, and praise the Lord, they tell me that I've already made a tidy little sum on paper.
Menachem Mendel. And now, Shena Shendel von Kasrilivke zu ihrem Mann Menachem Mendel in Ades.
In Jetzt, Shana Shandel from Paupersville to her husband Menachem Mendel in Odessa. Lichvoid ba'ali hayuker hanuged hamefursim hachuch mufleg moireini verabeini horav Reb Menachem Mendel naye yue.
To my esteemed husband, the dear, wealthy, renowned, incredibly wise, and learned teacher and example for us all, Mr. Menachem Mendel, may his light burn brightly.
Erstens komme ich dir zu melden, als wir sind alle Gott zu danken und besten gesinnt. Gib Gott das Nämliche von dir zu hören auf weiter nicht Ärger.
First off, I want to say that we are all, thank God, in the best of health. God grant the same to you, and may things not get worse.
Zweitens komme ich dir zu melden, als es hat mir wieder ungeriefen die amulige Spasme, als dein fetter Salmen gesucht geworden.
Secondly, I want to say that my old spasm came back. It should only happen to your Uncle Zalman.
Was hat dir gemacht, als ein schöner Mechak von der 1500 krepplich Naden als ein Jura, als ein Masel?
Who made such a fine mess of the $1,500 dowry, may have a year of such luck himself.
Wie sagt die Mama meine soll leben? Geschickt durch die Katz, Schalachmones.
How does my mother, may she live, put it? We set a fox to watch the chicken coop.
Hersti, halleweich soll liegen suchen, noch ob Meure, de Weste übrige Kerblech nicht umkicken, wie de Kicks nicht de Euren deine.
I only hope I'm telling you a lie, but I'm afraid you're going to see the rest of that money like you see your own ears.
Dein Glück, was de Mama weiß nicht, wie kein Wechslich, es wollt sich geteen chäuschig.
You're just lucky my mother doesn't know about these checks, or there would really be hell to pay.
In dus Mendel, was du schreibst, als de Verdienst danken Gott Geld, ist bei uns allem in sehr ungelegt.
And it's very nice, Mendel, that you write you're thank God earning money, and we're all elated to hear it.
No, was denn? Ich hab 80 schwarze Jahre, meine Sonnen. Als du schreibst schon schreibst du wie ein Mensch.
But what of it? May you have 80 black years, I mean my enemies, of course. If you're going to write, then write like a human being.
Für was sollst du nicht schreiben akkurat? Was ist das für ein Menschreure? Und das, was du handelst mit dem?
Why don't you write precisely what kind of merchandise this is that you're dealing with?
Wie teuer leist man das an Arschin?
Just how much does it cost per yard?
Sie verkauft sich es auf der Waage?
Or is it sold by weight?
Frag mich begehren, was das ist, in was man esst das.
Damned if I know what you're talking about or what you do with it.
Heint versteh ich nicht. Du sagst, als ot aus die eingekauftsreure, in ot ist schon du rewech.
And furthermore, I don't get what you're saying, that you bought up a stock and there's already profit.
Was ist das für ein Menschreure, was wächst bei dir so geschmeichtig?
So just what is this stuff that's growing so wildly?
Petscheritches, sagt die Mama, bedarf euch erregen.
As Mother says, even mushrooms need the rain.
Und als du rewech, für was verkaufst du nicht?
And if there's profit, why don't you sell it?
Auf was wartest du für Jahres?
So what are you waiting for, a shortage?
Und für was schreibst du nicht, wie du stehst ein und was esst du?
And why don't you write where you're staying and what you eat?
Etwas gleich, wie ich wollte gewähnt dir sein, ein Fremde, nicht kein Weib bis hinter den 20 Jahren.
It's like I'm some stranger and not your wife for the next 120 years.
Du sollst mich wollen folgen, was du gesehen, aushandeln sich, was Gierigen kommen besser heim mit ein bisschen Simmens.
Listen to me. Get rid of the stock of whatever it is and come home as soon as you can with the cash.
Wirst du gefunden, schönere Geschäften, wie hat das Duseke, ich soll also wissen von Kaduches, wie ich weiß, wie man rief das.
You'll find better things to do here than that, whatever it is you call it. May I know from burning sickness what I know about it.
In sei gesinnt, wie es wünscht dir von tiefen Herzen.
And be well as I wish you from the bottom of my heart.
Dein beemmes getreue Freu.
Your ever-loving wife,
Shana
Shana
Shandel. Well, needless to say, London goes belly up.
So Menachem Mendel goes out and finds himself another career.
And another career.
And another career.
Until he finally finds himself in the brand new business of selling.
Life insurance.
Shana Shandel remains, needless to say, unimpressed.
She writes thusly. Lichvoid Baali Hayuker Hanugid Hachuchem Myrene Harav Reb Menachem Mendel Neder Ewer.
To my esteemed husband, the dear, the wealthy, the renowned, the incredibly wise and learned teacher and example for us all, Mr. Menachem Mendel, may his light burn brightly.
Erstens komme ich dir zu melden, am wir sind alle Gott zu danken im besten gesinnt, gib Gott das Nämliche von dir zu hören auf weiter nicht ärger.
First off, I want to say that we are all, thank God, in the best of health. God grant to hear the same from you, and may things not get any worse.
Zweitens schreibe ich dir, als du bist nicht weit von einem Michiganem.
Secondly, I want to let you know you're nuts.
A neue Panusse hat ihm Gott sie geschickt, dem Bräutgeber meinem.
God has sent him a new career, my little breadwinner.
Wird straffieren Menschen zum Tod. Was heißt das, Mendel? Straffieren Menschen zum Tod?
He says he's going to insure people to death. What exactly do you mean you're going to insure people to death?
Kag heißt das, was du hast schon nie begedient, alle avoide Sures.
It's not enough you've thrown yourself from pillar to post?
Gewein schon wuss in der Court.
You've tried everything there is on the menu?
A Händler, a Tändler, a Meckler, a Schmeckler, a Geher, a Dreher, a Schatchen, a Badchen.
Everything? You've tried everything?
Bedarfst du noch ausprüfen handeln mit teute lebendige Mäßem?
Now you want to go and deal with dead, living corpses?
Gedenk mein Wort, Mendel. Als man wird dich bringen heim oder in a Leilach oder in Ketten, also wie du bist wert.
Remember what I'm telling you, Mendel. They're going to bring you back either in a sheet or in chains.
Bechtei, du sollst gedenken, als du hast a Weib bis 120 Jahre, was versteht besser von dir, Meshimedena.
So that you'll remember that you have a wife for the next 120 years who understands better than you do, you old heathen.
Jetzt mal sag ich dir mit Gitten.
I'm telling you nicely.
Soll auf dir kommen am Himmel.
You should find yourself a riot,
A Schreife,
a fire,
am
a
Geife.
plague.
In sei gesinnt, wie es wünscht dir von tiefen Herzen.
So you should be well as I wish you from the bottom of my heart.
Dein beämmes getreue Freu.
Your ever-loving wife, Shana Shandel.
So he writes her a letter telling her he's heading off to America to change his luck there.
And that's the last we hear of Menachem Mendel. Or is it? Thank you.
So, on that wonderful note, we turn to what you know and what you didn't know about Sholem Aleichem, Professor Kurt Levient.
Shalom Aleichem. And Shalom Aleichem to the family of Shalom Aleichem. And Shalom Aleichem to my little mishpacha who's here, especially the Einiklach with whom I study Yiddish and Shalom Aleichem, Ezra, Nava, Matan. You know the basic facts. Born in the Ukraine in 1859, Shalom Aleichem became the most beloved, popular writer in Yiddish literature. He visited New York briefly in 1906, 1907, and then returned to settle here in December 1914. On May 13th, 1916, he died of tuberculosis at the age of 57, mourned by more than 150,000 Jews who attended the funeral and mourned by the entire Jewish world. The New York Times reported this unprecedented event on page 1 and stated it was the largest funeral that New York City had ever seen. But did you know that Sholem Aleichem began his career with Hebrew? In fact, the English language Jewish Encyclopedia, published in the 1900s, in a short 2-paragraph article, cites Sholem Aleichem as a Hebrew novelist. And only in the second paragraph does it state that he also writes in Judeo-German. Judeo-German, not Yiddish. Sholem Aleichem was able to write any place, day or night, while eating or resting. Often, while strolling with family or friends, he could be seen gesturing, his lips moving silently, as if testing a forthcoming dialogue or scene. Writing was the driving force in his life, and it accounts for his prodigious output. The standard edition of Sholem Aleichem's works totals 28 volumes. I will soon tell you about one book that was not included in his collected works. By 1900, he had already come to be regarded as a classic writer and was earning his living solely from his pen. Later, he also toured European cities, giving highly successful readings from his works. Sholem Aleichem touched Jews so profoundly that once, after a reading he had given in Warsaw, a man came up to him, took his hand, and kissed it, saying, "You are our consolation. You have sweetened for us the bitterness of exile." Growing up in Russia, he had a deep appreciation of Russian literature, and he was influenced by writers like Gogol, Turgenev, Chekhov. In fact, in one of his letters, he stated that he was also influenced by Cervantes and Dickens. And in turn, later, his work influenced Soviet writers like Ilf and Petrov. Remember that great comic novel, The 12 Chairs? And he also influenced Isaac Babel, especially in his Odessa tales. The link is made even more memorable because Babel, who was fluent in Yiddish, was an editor of the Russian translations of Sholem Aleichem's stories. But the actual sources of Sholem Aleichem's writing go far beyond foreign literary models and extend, of course, into Jewish culture. Sholem Aleichem's humor, for example, did not spring forth fully grown. There was a quasi-literary precedent for it in some of the popular Yiddish pamphlets whose often banal clowning had no pretensions to high literary standards. In his autobiography, From the Fair, Sholem Aleichem tells of one pamphlet that his father read to a group of friends. The uproarious laughter made this young Sholem Aleichem envy the witty author, whose story contained some of the linguistic playfulness and penchant for joking that was common amongst village Jews in Sholem Aleichem's region. But more than any individual's literary creation, Sholem Aleichem utilized folklore, the heritage of an entire people. Folk humor, anecdotes, riddles, quips, sayings, and tricks of Talmud Torah youngsters, the early comic Purim plays, Hasidic tales, the folk tradition of parodying sacred verses from the Bible and phrases from the Midrash and Talmud, and finally, the folk speech itself, from the Wagoner's language to the curses of the shrew. The Jewish holidays, too, were always a source of inspiration. He wrote stories about all of them, Pesach, Purim, Yom Kippur, even minor holidays like Lag BaOmer and Hoshana Rabbah. But as far as I know, Shalom Aleichem does not have one story about Shabbos. All these are the varied roots which, blended with his genius for the comic, his powers of observation, and his excellent memory, blossomed into the unique style of Shalom Aleichem. During the latter part of the 19th century, there was a lively cultural struggle between Hebrew, the language of the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, and Yiddish, the folk language of Eastern European Jews. Proponents of the 19th century Haskalah denigrated Yiddish, which was their own mother tongue. Yiddish, they felt, was the language of women and of the uneducated masses. It was suitable only for daily conversation and cheap throwaway fiction, not for serious literature. In his autobiography From the Fair, Shalom Aleichem writes, "A man was ashamed to be seen holding a Yiddish book, lest people consider him a boor." One of the leaders of the Haskalah was Mendele Moiche Sfarim, who lived from 1836 to 1917. He was a founding father of both modern Yiddish and modern Hebrew literature. Since young Shalom Aleichem idolized Mendele and firmly believed in the Haskalah, he shunned Yiddish and began to write in Hebrew and in Russian. Soon, however, both Mendele and Shalom Aleichem realized that a movement that was meant to revolutionize Jewish education could not use a language that was understood only by the intellectual elite. So reluctantly, both Shalom Aleichem and Mendele turned back to Yiddish and made it a respectable tool for enlightenment. In 1883, when Shalom Aleichem was in his early 20s, he began to write in Yiddish, for the fun of it, as he put it. That remark underplays the seriousness of his approach and his sensitivity to all the values of Yiddishkeit, which remained in his work throughout his life. Here are a couple of examples. There is a touching tale called Methuselah, a Jewish horse. It tells about a scrawny old horse whom no one wants because he is so old and bedraggled, an elderly, poor, childless water carrier and his wife. Now they can finally afford to buy the horse he has dreamed of. Now he won't have to schlep water pails on foot. True, the horse is the hero of the tale, but sharing the spotlight are his new owners who baby and dandle their new possession with all the edelkeit as if a child had been born to them. Or take the tender story Tsar Bal Chaim, Pity for Living Creatures, where a little boy seeks to apply the values he's learned in Cheder, that a Jew should feel compassion towards animals. But at home, conflict arises. At home, before Pesach, he realizes that the carp swimming in the tub will soon be killed. He wants it to live, but his parents and the cook call him a fool and tell him to continue grating the horseradish, not realizing that the tears in his eyes are not from the horseradish. We know that humor was Shalom Aleichem forte, but did you know that Shalom Aleichem wrote a love story, actually a short novel, Shir HaShirim? It is surely the most beautiful love story in Jewish, that is Yiddish and Hebrew literature, and one of Shalom Aleichem seminal creative achievements. Boldly titled Shir HaShirim, the very same Hebrew title of the biblical Song of Songs, this novella is his only fiction so closely linked with a biblical text. It tells the story of Shimek, who was the first-person narrator, and his niece, Buzi. Here are some lines that describe the relationship. I had an older brother, Benny. He drowned. He left a young widow, 2 horses, and a baby. The horses were sold. The widow remarried somewhere far away, and the baby was brought to us. That was Buzi. Everyone thinks of us as brother and sister. She calls my father Papa, and my mother she calls Mama. And we love each other like a brother and a sister. One of the ironies that Shalom Aleichem imposes on his Song of Songs is the familial relationship between Shimek and Buzi. According to the Torah, a marriage between the young couple would be permitted, for as Buzi's uncle, Shimek is allowed to marry his niece. But then Shalom Aleichem cleverly introduces a stumbling block. Since the youngsters were raised as siblings in the same house, and Shalom Aleichem often quotes the biblical Song of Songs phrase in Hebrew, Achoti Kala or Choisi Kala, my sister, my bride, the taboo of incest cannot be cast away. Because Buzi and Shimek have grown up like brother and sister, family and townspeople would not approve of their marriage. Verses from the Hebrew Song of Songs are the intellectual and emotional matrix of Shalom Aleichem work, and his use of these verses adds an unusual musical counterpoint. This montage-like effect is not unusual in Yiddish and Hebrew literature, where often there are references and allusions to Bible, Talmud, Siddur, and other sacred texts. Here are a couple of lines that lead up to a dramatic verse. We see young Shimek and Buzi outside, and Shimek's mother calls. The day is done, the sun snuffed out. Its gold has turned blood red. The breeze that blows is soft and cool. Buzi urges me to go. I throw one last look at her, but she's not the Buzi of before. In my eyes, on this enchanted evening, her face is different now, with a different allure. I too stand there enchanted, but she motions with her hand, telling me to go. And I imagine I hear Buzi saying to me in the language of the Song of Songs, make haste, my beloved. Run, my darling, and be swift as a gazelle, quick as a deer or a young stag on the mountain of spices. In Shalom Aleichem Shir HaShirim, we have a perfectly realized work of art that depicts the reality of heartbreak without sentimentality. Have you ever heard of Shalom Aleichem novel Moshke Leganev, about a Jewish horse thief? Probably not, for it was not included in his 28-volume complete works, and we do not know why it was omitted. Shalom Aleichem and horse thieves? Yes, and he was proud of this work, which was first serialized in a Warsaw Yiddish paper in 1903. Up to the time he wrote Moshke Leganev, Shalom Aleichem had never devoted a full-length work to the Jewish underclass. Here he gives us life in the raw, showing us that Jewish statal society had, like the encompassing Russian society, its crooks and its underworld. In creating the character of Moshkele, Shalom Aleichem absorbed Chekhov's dictum. To describe horse thieves in 700 lines, I must all the time speak and think in their tone and feel in their spirit. Shalom Aleicham's final and uncompleted book was his autobiography, From the Fair. This book is by no means a traditional my life. Rather, written in the third person, it reads like a novel. Shalom Aleichem may have felt more comfortable with the fictional mode. Here's the beginning of one chapter entitled Treasures. There was a treasure in our village. Where did it come from? Khmelnytsky. Jews saved their treasures for years, and then Khmelnytsky came and seized and hid them. Who was Khmelnytsky? Shalom asked Shmulik. You don't know Khmelnytsky, you dummy? Khmelnytsky, that evil man, that Haman, stole millions of rubles worth of gold from the old nobles and from rich Jews and brought it here to all of us, here in Varonko. And one night, by the light of the moon, Khmelnytsky buried the treasure deep, deep at the foot of the hill near the Beis Medrash. And now it's overgrown, and a spell is cast on it, and no one can find it. And is it lost forever and ever? Who told you it's lost forever? If so, why did God create Kabbalah? The masters of Kabbalah, you dummy, know how to undo a spell. How? They know. They have a charm and a verse from the Psalms which has to be chanted 40 times 40 times. Which verse is it? Oh, you dummy, if I only knew the verse. Here in one book is the essence of Shalom Aleicham's narrative genius. Did you know that he considered his autobiography his crowning achievement? In his dedication of From the Fair to his children, Shalom Aleichem called his memoir, My Book of Books, the Song of Songs of My Soul. He began his autobiography in 1908 while living on the Italian Riviera, where he sought respite from his tuberculosis. It was there and in other places he would place an ad in the local newspaper stating where he lived and inviting his readers to visit him at certain hours of the day. He continued writing his autobiography in New York in 1915, 1 year before his death, and the installments appeared in the Yiddish daily Der Tog. The sunny atmosphere and the good humor of the autobiography are remarkable because the Yiddish master, accustomed to the clean air and warm sun of Switzerland and Italy, to the esteem of readers and friends, and to a comfortable lifestyle, Shalom Aleichem enjoyed none of these while writing in cold New York. The man who was a living legend could not even afford to go to Arizona for the winter. Ill, forlorn, and in poor financial circumstances, disappointed at the broken promises of Yiddish theater owners, mourning his son who had just died in Denmark, and writing during the bitterest period of his life, Shalom Aleichem was nevertheless able to look back in time to his memories of Eastern Europe and recreate his youth. When Shalom Aleichem came to New York City in 1914, he was honored with a grand reception in a great space, 41 blocks north of here. I see you're doing the math. 16 plus 41, 57, great space, 57th Street. That's right, Carnegie Hall, an evening in honor of Shalom Aleichem. As mentioned, he had been in New York City a few years earlier, so the city and its people were no strangers to him. After this Carnegie Hall reception, a famous New York lawyer approached him with his hands in his pockets, belly out, and said condescendingly, "Well, Mr. Shalom Aleichem, you're all right. I gotta give you a compliment. This is the first time in my life I heard so many fine jokes from a Yiddish writer. Shalom Aleichem looked at the New York Jewish lawyer up and down for a minute and then said, well, I must give you a compliment. This is the first time in my life I see a New York lawyer with his hands in his own pockets.
No end to jokes. Now it's a great pleasure to hear about Sholem Aleichem as myth and reality in contemporary Ukraine, and Professor David Fishman.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Safar genigen zu praven mit euch dem Jubiläum von Sholem Aleichem. On this occasion, the 100th anniversary of Sholem Aleichem's death, I'd like to consider how he's doing, how he's faring in the land where he was born and spent most of his life. That is the former Russian Empire, what is today Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Is he remembered over there? Is he memorialized, invoked? Perhaps more importantly, is he read? Is he viewed on the stage, studied in those countries, which now have somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 Jews? I will argue that Sholem Aleichem's memory is in some respects more alive today in the former Soviet Union than it is in the United States or even Israel. But it is a very peculiar kind of memory with much fantasy, projection, distortion, and with not much substance or content. Let me begin with some evidence. Statues, let me see if I can get the clicker to work. There. Statues of Sholem Aleichem stand in 4 cities on the globe. His statue is in Birobidzhan, the capital of the Jewish Autonomous Region, now in the Russian Federation, in Kiev, erected in 1997, in Moscow, 2001, and in Netanya, Israel, built in 2012 by immigrants from the former Soviet Union, Ukrainian Jews. In more than a dozen cities in Ukraine, there are streets named after Sholem Aleichem, including Kiev, Lviv, Chernovtsi, Kharkov, Vinnytsia, Pereyaslav, Chernigov, Uman, Zhytomyr, and Odessa. The enormous Jewish community center in Dnepropetrovsk, now Dnepro, is at 4 Sholem Aleichem Street in Dnepropetrovsk. So Sholem Aleichem is one of the best known Jewish names in Ukraine today. Alongside, at the top 3, I would say Igor Kolomoisky, who is one of the richest people in Ukraine, a politically powerful oligarch, and Volodymyr Groysman, who is currently Ukraine's prime minister, Jewish prime minister. But of the 3, I would dare say, Sholem Aleichem is probably the one viewed most favorably. In order to understand Sholem Aleichem's popularity in Ukraine, we need to go back to the Soviet period. The Soviets built Sholem Aleichem up into the acknowledged Jewish classical author par excellence. And by extension, they made him into a kind of Soviet Jewish hero. His works appeared in hundreds of thousands of copies in Yiddish and in millions of copies in Russian and in other languages of the Soviet Union. His works were performed on the stage of the Moscow State Yiddish Theater, other Yiddish theaters. In Soviet Kiev, a street was named after Sholem Aleichem in 1926 to mark the 10th anniversary of his death. Now, this was a political and cultural choice. At the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, there were three great Yiddish classics. Mendele Mercher Svorim was born in Kapulya, not far from Minsk, in Belarusia. Yud Lamed Peretz was born in Zamość, Poland. And then there was Sholem Aleichem, born in Pereyaslav, Ukraine. But for various reasons, the other writers were not appropriate, were not as appropriate for the role of the Jewish classical writer of the USSR. Of course, the Soviet myth of Sholem Aleichem was shaped to fit Soviet ideals and values. His Zionism, Sholem Aleichem was a Zionist, was suppressed. His love and devotion to the weak, the poor, and the oppressed was highlighted. The fact that Sholem Aleichem moved to America was downplayed. His connections with Russian writers and Russian literature was emphasized. Certain works were printed and performed frequently, others disappeared, translations were censored. But Sholem Aleichem was almost never taboo in the USSR, except for the period of late Stalinism, 1949 to 1953, which was characterized by intense anti-Semitic campaigns and the liquidation of Yiddish culture. The centennial of Sholem Aleichem's birth in 1959 was marked with commemorative events in Moscow and Kiev, with the publication of a 6-volume edition of Sholem Aleichem's works in Russian translation, a commemorative stamp, and a memorial plaque was placed at an address in Kiev where Sholem Aleichem lived in 1959. The image of Sholem Aleichem as a positive Soviet Jewish figure persisted even in the 1970s, a period of intense anti-Semitism under the guise of anti-Zionism, when the authorities struggled against the movement for Aliyah and against various forms of independent Jewish activity. Even then, in the 70s, there was a reprint edition of the 6-volume set in 1971 to 1974. A separate edition of Tevye appeared in 1973, and Soviet encyclopedias, like the 3rd edition of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia and the Short Literary Encyclopedia, include entries on Sholem Aleichem. There are no entries on Peretz. There are no entries on Mendele. So Sholem Aleichem was distorted and manipulated in the USSR, but he was not suppressed. He was, in fact, elevated. And in that sense, he fared much better than other parts of Jewish literature and culture. Then came the rule of Mikhail Gorbachev, the period of glasnost and perestroika from 1986 to 1991, when Jewish public life was permitted to resume in the USSR for the first time in many decades. Jews created organizations and associations that were neither government-controlled nor dissident, and they called them Jewish culture societies. And perhaps unsurprisingly, many of those Jewish culture societies were named after Sholem Aleichem, especially in Ukraine. The largest Sholem Aleichem Jewish culture societies were in Lviv and Kiev. This is a picture. I don't know if you can make out the Yiddish, but it does say Lvover Yiddische Gesellschaft of Sholem Aleichem's Namen. In Lviv, a plaque marking a house where Sholem Aleichem had lived was affixed in 1990. This was striking, since Sholem Aleichem lived in Lviv for just a few months. In 1905, 1906, when he left Tsarist Russia and was en route to America. He wasn't really associated with the city or with the region of Galicia in any significant way, but the plaque, in Yiddish and Ukrainian, was about more than Sholem Aleichem. It was the first Jewish plaque in Lviv, with Yiddish letters in public space. It was an affirmation in this Gorbachev era that Jews were a legitimate part of the city and that they were proud of their identity and their culture. In this case, Sholem Aleichem was synonymous with Jewishness and was used as a symbol of Jewishness. And plaques in the next few years popped up in various places, in Bielya Tserkva, in Boyarka, or Sholem Aleichem's town called Boiberik. Also in the Gorbachev era, Sholem Aleichem appeared for the first time on the mainstream Russian and Ukrainian stage. But it wasn't Fiddler on the Roof. Fiddler, in fact, was never a success in Russian or Ukrainian. Rather, it was a different play based on the Tevye stories called A Memorial Prayer, Pominalna Molitva, written by Grigory Gorin. It premiered in Russian in the spring of 1989, starring Evgeny Leonov in the Lencom Theater in Moscow. And it ran for 3 years. That is, the play outlasted the Soviet Union. It started in the Soviet Union, it ended in Russia, and was shown on Russian TV in 1993. The drama premiered in Kiev 6 months later in Ukrainian under the name Tevye Tevel and starred the well-known Ukrainian actor Bogdan Stupka. In Kiev, it didn't run for 3 years, it ran for 20 years. Tevye Tevel is a singularly important cultural event because most Ukrainians became familiar or refamiliar with Sholem Aleichem through this drama, and thanks to Stupka, who was himself something of a Ukrainian national hero as an artist. Tevye Tevel isn't a musical, it's a drama, a kind of philosophic drama, a tragedy with occasional comic moments. It is full of monologues and dialogues on life, work, money, family, religion, Jews and Gentiles, with Tevye in the role of a folk philosopher. Here's what one Russian playbill had to say about the drama. When the previous old world is collapsing and family members don't observe traditional ways, when your closest people leave you, and when it seems there is no God, it seems that life on earth is unnecessary and meaningless. How can one remain a human being under such circumstances? How not to lose yourself in your humanity and dignity in a worrisome and difficult time? The main thing, according to this drama, is not to distort your face with evil and hatred, to preserve in yourself the faculties of sympathy and compassion, not to lose the God that is inside you, never to give up believing. This is the path taken by the main hero, Tevye the dairyman, to find new meaning in life and to learn how to live again. So Tevye is a kind of a guide for the perplexed of our times. A Ukrainian critic offered the following assessment. The subject of the play is the fate of Jewish families in Tsarist times. These simple Jews try to live and rejoice despite everything. And despite the differences of religious faith and mentality, viewers are surprised to observe scenes from life that are well known to many of us. And what appeared at the beginning of the play as something distant and unacceptable becomes by the end of the play something close and dear. You forget that the Jew Tevye is being played by the Ukrainian Bogdan Stupka. His performance creates such a wise and colorful character, you forget that Tevye spoke Yiddish, not Ukrainian. Tevye Tevel became one of the most popular plays in modern Ukrainian theater, and I believe it's probably the most important event in post-Soviet Ukrainian-Jewish relations, in improving Ukrainian-Jewish relations. So it's this combination of the Jewish attachment to Sholem Aleichem, as exemplified by those many societies and plaques, and the success of Tevye on the Ukrainian stage that led to the next major event, that is the erection of the Sholem Aleichem statue in downtown Kiev in 1997. At the inauguration of the statue, the audience was addressed by the mayor of Kiev, by the deputy chief of staff of the presidential administration of Ukraine, and by the first secretary of the Israeli embassy. But under Ukrainian independence, the myth of Sholem Aleichem was updated for new circumstances. And now there were two new themes in the new Ukrainian myth of Sholem Aleichem. First, his connection to Judaism and Jewish tradition, and second, his patriotic love of Ukraine. These images are on display in the two Sholem Aleichem museums that exist in Ukraine today. One is in his native Pereyaslav, that's this one. It was founded in 1978, still in Soviet times, but it's been significantly updated since then. And the second museum is in Kiev. and it was opened on the occasion of Shalom Aleichem's 150th birthday in 2009. Now, both museums are very modest endeavors. It's a little hut in Pereyaslav, 3 rooms in a commercial mall in Kiev. They have small attendance levels, visitor levels. Many of the visitors, and especially in Pereyaslav again, are not Jews, but ethnic Ukrainians. The Pereyaslav Museum, as you saw, gotta go back, is located on a multi-museum campus, right, which includes a space museum, a museum of bread, and a transportation museum. But the founder was able to sneak in among that large complex of museums, the Sholem Aleichem Museum in 1978. It's a typical memorial museum in the Russian-Ukrainian tradition. It reproduces the author's imaginary home at the end of the 19th century, his bed, his chairs, his desk, his pens, and it even contains a mirror with which the curators claim actually hung in Sholem Aleichem's apartment in Kiev. Both Sholem Aleichem museums provide an introduction to Jewish religious tradition, and this is interesting. In Pereyaslav, the dining room table, Sholem Aleicham's dining room table, features challah covers, Sabbath candle holders, Kiddush wine, a Hanukkah menorah, an etrog box. The museum in Kiev also has 2 cabinets full of Jewish ritual objects. And in Kiev, tour guides explain the artifacts and their associated rituals to visitors. So Sholem Aleichem is now being used as the entry point to Jewish religion and Jewish tradition. In this sense, the Sholem Aleichem museums reflect a broader trend in Russian Jewry and even in Ukrainian Jewry to increasingly conceive of themselves as a confessional group, as a religious group, defined first and foremost by their religion and led by their rabbis. Of course, it should be kept in mind that the Sholem Aleichem Museum in Kiev is the only Jewish museum in Kiev, in the capital city. Kiev is one of the few capital cities in Europe that does not have a major Jewish museum. So in Kiev, the Sholem Aleichem Museum doubles as the Jewish museum of sorts, and it has hosted lectures on synagogue architecture, on tombstone art, on folk art, like a Jewish museum would do. The Pereyaslav Museum in particular recast Sholem Aleichem as a Ukrainian Jewish patriot. That is, as a positive figure that every Ukrainian should identify with. I'll quote here the museum's guidebook published in 2003. Great was the writer's love of Ukraine, his homeland. Sholem Aleichem always regarded Shevchenko as a real people's writer. Shevchenko is the Ukrainian national poet. Kobzar stood on his bookshelf, it's a work by Shevchenko, in its most honorable place. He loved to sing Ukrainian folk songs. Sholem Aleichem said a wise thought, appealing to the Jewish people. The future of our people is only here in the country where we live. I doubt Sholem Aleichem said that. And then perhaps realizing that it had gone too far in projecting Ukrainianism onto Sholem Aleichem, the guidebook does add a counterbalancing sentence. Sholem Aleichem also actively supported Zionism. He dreamed of the creation of an independent Jewish state. And the same kind of rhetoric was used by the vice premier of Ukraine at the opening of the Sholem Aleichem Museum in Kiev in 2009. I quote again the vice premier at that time. He loved Ukraine. This love was, is, and will be mutual. Sholem Aleichem is dear to us as a person and as a writer. With his love, he created great works of literature for Ukraine, for Ukrainians, for the entire world. It is remarkable that the words Jews and Jewish writer do not appear in the vice premier's remarks. Thus, under Soviet rule, Sholem Aleichem was a man of the people, devoted to the weak and the oppressed. He wasn't a communist, but he was a literary fellow traveler. And now in independent Ukraine, he loved his homeland, its folklore, its literature. So Sholem Aleichem is a pliable symbol for whatever the values are in that time. Finally, I'd like to turn to the myth, from myth to the literary reality, to what extent is Sholem Aleichem actually published, read, and studied in Ukraine, and really Russia and Ukraine? Here I have some statistics, courtesy of Alexander Frankel of St. Petersburg, who edits a journal on Jewish book lore and bibliography. This is from the Museum in Pereyaslav. I don't have time to talk about it. 39 volumes of Sholem Aleichem have appeared in Russia and in Ukraine since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. 30 volumes in Russia, 9 volumes in Ukraine, including a 4-volume bilingual set of his collected works published in Ukraine. I'm counting that as 4 volumes out of the 9. Of those 9 published in Ukraine, 7 are in Russian, 2 are in Ukrainian. Now, make sense of those numbers. Like many other inhabitants of Ukraine, Ukrainian Jews are mainly Russian-speaking and are Russian-reading. And at least until 2 years ago, with the Euromaidan revolution, the country, Ukraine, was also part of the Russian book market. What I'm telling you is we can assume that Sholem Aleichem books published in Moscow and St. Petersburg were also distributed and read in Ukraine. We really can't separate the two out. Which works have been reprinted? The Sholem Aleichem canon is broader in the former Soviet Union than it is in America. Yes, Tevye has had 11 editions, but Motl the Cantor's son has had 8 editions, Menachem Mendel 4 editions, and Wandering Stars, a work on Yiddish theater, which is not well known in the West, also 4 editions. And most of these volumes were published by commercial publishers in presses of runs of 5,000 copies, which is impressive for today's Russian book market. And most of the volumes did not have grants or subventions. They are commercially sold books. So there is a market for Sholem Aleichem in Russian translation. And I should add, those books are sold not only in Russia and Ukraine, but also here in America and in Israel, where there are a lot of Russian-speaking Jews. By and large, current editions of Sholem Aleichem reprint the Soviet translations, which I mentioned before are flawed and really are censored. There are very few new translations from Yiddish, the notable exception being some of the work by Valery Dimshitz in St. Petersburg. So these publication figures I consider quite impressive, especially in light of the fact that Sholem Aleichem is not taught as part of the curriculum in any middle school or high school, anywhere in Russia or Ukraine. Even Jewish schools, and there are many Jewish day schools in the former Soviet Union, do not teach Sholem Aleichem because most of them are under strictly Orthodox auspices. So they don't consider modern Jewish literature a worthwhile subject. Jewish schools and Jewish camps don't stage Tevye Tevel the way in America Jewish schools and camps stage Fiddler. Finally, the position of Yiddish literature in the Ukrainian Academy is very weak, virtually non-existent. There are no scholars of Yiddish literature at Ukrainian universities. There are no courses of Yiddish literature or Jewish literature in translation. I should note that both these things, scholars and courses, are in abundance in neighboring Poland. But the situation of Yiddish studies in Ukraine is a vast wasteland. So Sholem Aleichem is absent in the academy, and therefore absent from serious literary criticism and literary magazines. He is often mentioned as an influence on the Russian Jewish writer Isaac Babel, who enjoys literary acclaim, but he is not considered by critics in his own right. Will Sholem Aleichem continue to be a presence in memory and in culture of Ukraine in the 21st century? As Tevye might say, we have a great God, only he knows. Thank you.
And now we will hear about Kozrilivka, Mazipievka, and Yechupitz, Ukraine as Myth and Reality, and Sholem Aleichem's writing, Professor Mikhail Krutikov.
So, As we heard already, Sholem Aleichem was a very versatile writer, probably the most versatile writer in Yiddish literature. And he created a memorable cast of characters who typified various aspects of Jewish collective neshama. Tevi with his wife and daughters, Menachem Mendel and Shana Shendel, Mottl with his family, and many more men and women whose voices still reverberate in the Jewish collective memory. Most of them come from Sholem Aleichem's homeland in the Ukrainian heartland in Kiev and Poltava gubernias of the Russian Empire, which combined had 500,000 Jews on the eve of the First World War. So the Kiev gubernia had the largest Jewish population in the Russian Empire, apart from Warsaw, in the Pale of Settlement. But with some exceptions, his characters, like himself, do not stay put in the places of their birth. Like so many Jews in the late 19th and 20th centuries, they traveled some around Russia and some around the world. They moved from small shtetl to the big cities of the Russian Empire, such as Kiev, Odessa, Warsaw. They immigrated to America via Lemberg, Krakow, Vienna, Antwerp, London. And coming to New York, they discovered, to their surprise, as Mottl did, that, now I quote, the entire Kasrilovka has moved to America. In short, Sholem Aleichem presents us with a colorful and dynamic portrait of the world at the turn of the 20th century, as seen through the eyes of an ordinary Jew from central Ukraine. Sholem Aleichem's first fictional location, Mazepovka, is modeled on his birthplace, the old Ukrainian town of Pereyaslav that we just saw, which had a very rich historical legacy. It was the site of the Cossack Council of Pereyaslav in 1654, after the Khmelnytsky uprising, at which the Cossack state took a historic oath of allegiance to Muscovy. So it was a really fatal turn in Ukrainian history. The memory of these events was reactivating during the reign of Alexander II, Alexander III, in the 1860s and 1880s, at the time of Sholem Aleichem's youth, when Ukraine came to play a key role in the creation of Russian nationalist imperial mythology. On the contrary, Ivan Mazepa, who succeeded Khmelnytsky as a Cossack hetman, the leader, and rebuilt the devastated left bank Ukraine, was remembered in the Russian imperial memory as the epitome of traitor, because he switched his allegiance from the Russian Tsar Peter the Great to his Swedish enemy Charles XII at a critical moment of the Battle of Poltava, and he lost. So until today, Mazepa is occasionally denounced as anathema in some of Russian Orthodox churches. So, Sholem Aleichem, as he makes it clear in his introduction to his novel Stempenu, this was his first major novel, written in the late 1880s, borrowed the idea of inventing ironic and satirical fictional shtetl names from his literary grandfather Mendeleev Abramovich, who in turn probably was influenced by Israel Axenfeld, the very first Yiddish novelist. But unlike those shtetl like Loi Hayopele, which literally means no such will, a place that doesn't exist, that was Axenfeld's invention, or Tonyadovki or Gnilopatsk, that were well known to the readers of Mendele. Sholem Aleichem's Mazepovka and Kasrilovka are not purely abstract locations, as it were Jewish islands in the Gentile Sea that exist outside real history and geography. Like everything in his works, they are constructed out of real details which are then reimagined and reassembled into a symbolic image. But they retain their local and historical flavor. Mazepovka is the location of his two Yiddish romanons, Stempenu and Yosele Solovey, written in the late 80s. At that time, he was happily living in Kiev with his young family, supported by the fortune that he inherited from his rich father-in-law, and pursued an ambitious plan of inventing Yiddish literature. He had two literary models for his novels, Mendele and Émile Zola. His ambition was to produce a stream of novels that would portray Jewish life in all its rich variety, with Berdichev as a kind of Jewish Paris. Mazepovka appears as a backward, lazy, content, but not at all poor. Indeed, as some Soviet critics have pointed out, Sholem Aleichem's early novels are remarkably aloof to the dramatic contemporary events, pogroms, expulsions from the countryside, mass immigrations, and general atmosphere of political and social reaction after the assassination of Alexander II. Mazepovka residents are eating, shopping, enjoying music and singing, quarreling, and falling in love. The town is portrayed as quintessentially Jewish with a middle-class center around the marketplace. And on Shabbos, Jewish youth stroll along the central Berdichev Street. Of course, it's named after that kind of Jewish Paris. While the dangerous site where Stempeniou invites Rochele, the main character, for an intimate conversation is located at the outskirts. This is a very interesting structure of that Ukrainian town. We wouldn't even call it a shtetl. Now I quote from Stempeniou. In the town of Mazepovka, there is a monastery, which they say was built by Mazepa. A high white stone wall surrounding the monastery on all four sides and occupies 3/4 of the town. On one side of the wall, there are shops in niches, and on the other side, deep cellars where they say the Haidamaks hid all their weapons, and where apples and all kinds of goods are now stored. Facing it, there are houses and cabins, yards and patches, both Jewish and Christian, and the narrow street running between the bare wall of the monastery and the houses is called Monastery Street. So this is a shtetl that is surrounded by that dangerous periphery where the Haidamaks, the Cossacks, hid their weapons, so there is still some danger. There's a place where good Jewish girls are not advised to go. And of course, Rochele does go there, but nothing happens. Thus, the stagnant but relatively safe Jewish Mazepovka is enclosed by this dangerously periphery with the buried memory of Cossack violence. The Jewish shtetl is literally physically surrounded by Ukrainian history. Kasrylivka is a very different kind of place. It emerges around 1900, so it's 12, perhaps 13 years after Mazepovka. And that was a very eventful and very dramatic decade in Sholem Aleichem's life when he lost his money, he had to run away, then he returned to Russia, and then he realized that he had to earn his living by writing, that there was no more money to spend. It would later take over Mazepovka. In the early versions of Menachem Mendel, his letters were addressed actually to his wife, who was supposed to be in Mazepovka. And only later, this Mazepovka was replaced by Kasrylivka. Kasrylivka is introduced as a quintessentially Jewish place. In a cycle of Kasrylivka stories, the narrator acts as a guide, introducing us to this exotic place. And I quote again, "The town of little people where I take you, my dear reader, is located in the very midst of the blessed Pale of settlement. Shoved into a corner, into the back country, detached from the world around it, it stands like an orphan, enchanted, bewitched, and self-absorbed, as if it has nothing to do with all the tumult for which people have invented fancy words like culture, progress, civilization." So we have this cute image of a shtetl that exists on its own, that is not connected to the surrounding world, but this is actually not the case. This is not what we learn from those stories. So once we get inside, we realize that the tumult of modernity is very much present in the life of the Kasrilikas, as the inhabitants of Kasrylivka are called. And Mark Kaplan, contemporary scholar, argues that, I quote, "The real target of these stories is not so much traditional Jewish life as the emerging modern ideologies and social trends." So Sholem Aleichem created Kasrylivka as a locus not for portraying the traditional shtetl life, as what we see, for example, in The Fiddler on the Roof, but for responding to the contemporary events, such as Dreyfus Affair, Zionism, technical innovations. Kasrylivka provided him with a perspective on the world at large. Thus, while Mazepovka represents, in the spirit of 19th century realism, an object of Sholem Aleichem's progressivist social critique of the traditional Jewish Steiger lifestyle, particularly of the old-fashioned family and gender relationship, and Kasrylivka exemplifies the destructive impact of modernity, portrayed ironically from the perspective of kleine Menschlich mit kleine Hasogis, little people with little minds. Again, Kaplan puts it nicely, it's inverted ideological critique of modernity. The change of message and perspective reflects in the style and genre. Instead of sentimental middle-brow novels like Stempeniou and Yossi Solovey, we have now short stories with no deep psychologically developed characters, no clear chronology, and they're dominated by the leitmotif of destruction and death represented by the magnificent cemetery that dominates the landscape of Kasrilovka. Finally, Yehupets is another important locus of Sholem Aleichem's work. Unlike Odessa, Warsaw, and Warsaw, Kiev was never, to my knowledge, actually called in Sholem Aleichem's work by its real name. Everybody understands that Yehupets is Kiev, but I think he never uses the word Kiev, actually. It appears first as a desired destination in Stempenu. In the epilogue, we find out that Rochel has moved there with her husband, and they have a baby and a little shop. Of course, real Kiev was not a happy place for most of the shtetl Jews who moved there in search of opportunity. The holy city of Kiev had a special and very complicated legal status with regard to Jewish settlement in the Russian Empire. It was located at the very heart of the Pale. But originally, Jews were not allowed to live in the city, and only after 1860, some categories of Jews were admitted to the city. The most prestigious upper parts were open only for wealthy merchants, doctors, and lawyers. The lower, poorer district were accessible to the middle-class merchants of Second Guild, registered artisans, students, and immediately outside the city borders was the Pale of Settlement where any Jew could live. So literally the height defined your social status. Which means, of course, that Kiev had a large number of Jews who resided there illegally. Most of them temporarily, but some long-term. For that, they had to bribe the police or procure some false documents. So Kiev, what was a dangerous and exciting place. It was a site of permanent encounter, tension, conflict, and cohabitation between Jews and Christians. It was also a hotbed of Russian nationalism and Orthodox Christianity. On Christian holidays and in the summer, it was flooded by thousands and thousands of pilgrims coming to its famous monasteries and icons. It was also a center of emerging Ukrainian national culture and politics. There was also a significant Polish population of many landowners who owned their estates in Ukraine, but they also lived in Kiev. So Kiev attracted all kinds of Jews from near and far away by its diverse opportunities, odd jobs soliciting charity, small trade, and large-scale speculations, study at the prestigious university or at many private professional schools. In those days, business and dentistry had a much lower prestige than liberal arts. It was the city where integration and segregation were part of the same daily and nightly experience. This perplexing aspect of Kiev is best represented in The Bloody Hoax, the Blutig Spaß, one of Sholem Aleichem's latest novel, which was inspired by the Baylis affair. It tells an improbable story of two young men who swap identities. A Russian nobleman, Grigory Popov, becomes a Shklov Jew, Hershky Rabinovich, in order to get a first-hand experience of anti-Jewish discrimination, whereas Rabinovich gets to enjoy a new life as a privileged student and a member of Russian high society. Such a fantasy could only plausibly, of course it was pure fantasy, but it could only plausibly play out in Kiev, where Jews and Christians routinely mixed on the streets, in shops and cafes, but they were also strictly segregated when it came to the legal status, residency, and occupation. Unlike Odessa, Vilna, Warsaw, three largest Jewish urban communities in the Russian Empire, which were open to Jews, Kiev was a borderland beyond the border. There was even a street, as the Jewish landlords tell this hapless Popov, who became Rabinovich, there was a street where Jews were allowed to live on one side but not on the other side. The bustling day life was followed by dangerous nights when the police usually conducted its raids. Oblava, the raid, was a routine experience for Kiev, but not typical for the rest of the empire, which is why it is so prominently, figures so prominently in many Kiev Jewish narratives. So whenever you have memoirs or stories set in Kiev, there is always a night raid when police comes to search a Jewish house and finds Jews who stay there legally and take them to the police precinct and then send them away to the place where they belong. Towards the end of his life, Sholem Aleichem revisits Kasrilovki, and this happens in his great autobiography, Funam Yavid. Now, Kasrilovki is split into two different images. One Kasrilovki, as we just heard in the beginning, has moved to New York Lower East Side. Well, the other one is forever left in the past and is commemorated in Sholem Aleichem's autobiography. He takes off the mask, telling us in the second chapter of his autobiography, and I quote in Kurt Levian's translation, in case you want to know, Kasrilovki is in Little Russia, in the province of Poltava, near the historic old town of Pereyaslav. Actually, it's not called Kasrilovki, but Voronka. And then Sholem Aleichem goes on to tell his story, his life, his early life in that little shtetl, Voronka, or Voronki, or Voronkova. In his memory, Voronka Kasrilovki looms larger than Odessa, Paris, London, or even New York. It had the largest and the richest market. It had old base medrash, which many years ago survived an attack by Mazepa, which actually makes historically no sense, because Mazepa didn't really attack those places. It was Khmelnytsky, but for some reason, again, he switches this Mazepa-Khmelnytsky imagery. And a big hill near the base medrash, and I quote again in Levian's translation, so high its peak almost touches the clouds, and behind which, as everyone knows, a treasure is buried from Khmelnytsky's times, and of course, a large, old, and imposing cemetery. So, to conclude, 50 years ago, that was approximately the 50th yahrzeit of Sholem Aleichem, Soviet Yiddish writer Shmuel Gardon, who before that he had spent about 7 years in the Gulag in prison, he was released in 1956, he made a pilgrimage to Voronkova, which he described in his travelogues. He could not recognize the place according to Sholem Aleichem's description. There was no marketplace, no Jewish houses. Even dust, as he tells us, was not the dust of the shtetl, it was the rural dust, dust of the village. There was no big hill. The revelation came to Gardon when he encountered a local librarian. He was really disappointed. He thought that maybe that was the wrong place, so he thought that he decided to leave. And then he walked into the library, and I guess he found maybe some of those Sholem Aleichem's books there. He also met a librarian who happened to be Jewish and who spoke Yiddish. And that, as he says, this heartike Ukrainischer Yiddish, this hearty Ukrainian Yiddish, somehow transformed him, and he had this sort of revelation. It was really a Hasidic sort of pilgrimage. And he suddenly saw the absent hill, because the hill was no longer there. Apparently, local residents took it away, searching for that treasure. So in his imagination, Gardon climbs on the top of that imaginary hill and calls, in the words of Fundam Yarid, "Wer es weiß etwas, wer es hat gehört von ihm, soll sich abrufen." If anyone has heard of him, please let me know. Thank you.
So now we will hear from Volksschreiber to Showbiz, Fiddler on the Roof, and the Invention of Jewish American Folklore, Professor Elissa Solomon.
Okay. Good afternoon. Well, present company very much accepted. There are very few Americans who can think of Sholem Aleichem without thinking of Fiddler on the Roof. The blockbuster musical opened in 1964, more than half a century ago. Oh, thank you. Should I help? Good idea. Okay, so the musical opened in 1964, more than half a century ago, and it's still flourishing today with a new Broadway production currently on the boards, and scores of productions in schools and community theaters around the world. For many millions of people, for better or for worse, Fiddler on the Roof is their introduction to Sholem Aleichem, their introduction to Yiddishkeit in general, and even in some cases, their introduction to Jews. If Sholem Aleichem became a synonym for Jewishness in Ukraine, as we heard a few minutes ago. Fiddler on the Roof has become that synonym in many spheres of the United States and beyond. For some Yiddishists, this has definitely been for the worst. When Fiddler opened, Irving Howe famously wrote a scathing review and commentary where he chided the show for presenting, quote, the cutest shtetl we never had. And to this day, Yiddish scholars like Ruth Weiss and theater experts like Robert Brustein decry the musical for flattening out, oversimplifying, and sentimentalizing the brilliant work of the master storyteller. Well, they have an undebatable point. Over the 20 years in which Sholem Aleichem periodically brought out a story featuring the affable dairyman responding to the turbulent currents of Jewish life in the Pale and in the wider world beyond, Sholem Aleichem wrote tragicomic, linguistically sophisticated, contextually rich prose, while the Broadway musical, based on a few of those Tevye stories, is, well, a Broadway musical. A darned good one, but by definition, not the same kind of work of literary nuance and layered irony. So the critics are right. But, nu, vad denn? The cultural fact of Fiddler's enormous success, global reach, and abiding power is fascinating in itself, and a window into the ongoing project of Jewish self-definition and representation. And it has helped turn attention toward the original works of Sholem Aleichem. Back in the early 1960s, when the librettist Joe Stein and the music and lyrics duo Jerry Bach and Sheldon Harnick decided to adapt the Tevye stories into a musical, the popular English translation of the Tevye stories by Francis Butwin, which had been published in 1949, was out of print. Joe Stein had to go looking for it and found it in a used bookstore. But the two Butwin volumes from the 1940s were reissued after Fiddler's smash opening, and many more English versions of Sholem Aleichem's work has remained available ever since. Even the algorithm on Amazon.com helps steer Fiddler fans to the Yiddish Klassiker. If you search the script for Fiddler on the Roof, it will make these recommendations. Context matters too. It's worth remembering that when Fiddler premiered, Broadway had seen precious little work related to Yiddish. At that point, images of Eastern European Jewry flourished exclusively in the Yiddish language theaters popular with the immigrant generation, and in the post-war era in significant books and artworks that shaped America's images of the Eastern European Jewish past, but that were mostly consumed in private or in Jewish venues. The only exceptions were shows that made Yiddish funny. Imports from the upstate New York resorts known as the Borscht Belt, like these two revues that played on Broadway in the 1950s, Bagels and Yucks and the Borschtcapades. Otherwise, on the Great White Way, Jews had to be white, not green. And Fiddler was the first big public work to call forth an idea of the old country with affection, evoking the richness of a vanished world and asserting that its people found their continuance in the dizzying success of the new generation of Jewish Americans. We also know that Sholem Aleichem was attracted to showbiz. He desperately wanted to make it big in New York's Yiddish theater. He thought it would be a sure way to make a killing when his coffers were running low in Europe, and that's why he came here in 1906, not just for a visit, but in fact to try to become a successful playwright. He wrote fawning letters to Jacob Adler and Boris Tomaszewski, among others, hoping for productions of his plays. And though the productions that finally came to pass under these two great actor-managers in the winter of 1907 utterly flopped, leaving Sholem Aleichem depressed about America and departing New York back to Europe, he never gave up. He kept appealing to the directors with new projects. When he wrote his own dramatic adaptation of the Tevye stories and hoped that Adler would play the title role, he didn't worry so much about the ways in which theatrical form flattened the nuances of his prose. Sholem Aleichem might not have recognized the Broadway Tevye fully as his own. There are many changes to the musical, as I'm sure everyone is aware, but I think he certainly would have cashed the check. More important, I'd like to suggest today that Fiddler on the Roof shares and extends something important in the spirit of Sholem Aleichem and his own abiding power, namely its successful effort to address and even to construct a popular folk. The author's very moniker reflected his populism, as we know. The multilingual, urbane businessman in his tightly buttoned vests and wire-framed spectacles, who spoke Russian at home with his children, fashioned himself into the Volksschreiber, the folk writer who took stage as the Yiddish voice of the people. And readers, those who remained in the Stadtlach, those who had left them behind, embraced the author as their own. By the author's design, they invoked his name every time they said hello. The Yiddishists who would defend Sholem Aleichem from the vulgarities of Broadway make an argument that I don't think Sholem Aleichem himself would ever have countenanced. That is, they blame the audience. Howe, for one, denounced, quote, the spiritual anemia of the middle-class Jewish world, which by now seems firmly linked to Broadway. Like the good maskil he was as a young writer, Sholem Aleichem may have wanted to uplift the masses, but his work neither condescends nor condemns. His love for the Jewish folk suffuses his stories, and he was not exactly ashamed that they were popular. Fiddler on the Roof spoke to a new folk, giving mid-20th century American Jews an unexpected and colossal surge of pride and a cultural focal point for reckoning with two powerful contradictory feelings that had swept Jewish America in that period. On the one hand, the exuberance of post-war American prosperity and a social and professional access Jews had never before enjoyed, and on the other, the devastation of Jewish obliteration in Europe. In recalling Jewish audiences so fondly to what had been in many cases a neglected or even rejected connection to Yiddishkeit, Fiddler on the Roof, a constructed piece of that very artificial form called the Broadway musical, turned into nothing less than folklore. So I want to give you 3 examples. First, perhaps most important, the character of Tevye as filtered through Broadway, then Fiddler's songs, and then especially the choreography by Jerome Robbins. So just as Sholem Aleichem's Tevye was quickly regarded in the Yiddish world as a lovable and complex everyman, so has Broadway's Tevye become a folk hero of Jewish America and beyond. In many instances of popular culture and religious ritual in the U.S., the Broadway Tevye has gathered authority on our history and legacy. Tevye's lines from Fiddler are often quoted by American rabbis, as happened at my own nephew's wedding a couple of years ago, and as others often do in high holiday sermons. I get emails now. My book on Fiddler has been out for 2 years, and both cycles of the high holidays I've gotten emails from rabbis I never heard of sharing their sermons with me because they wanted me to know that they quoted Tevye in their Rosh Hashanah sermons. With distinct reference to the musical through a violin motif, 2 dairy businesses, one in Florida and one in Ukraine, invoke Tevye as a brand to peddle their milk. And one of the most beloved Tevyes over the years was Theodore Bickel, who's performed the role a couple of thousand times, and he demonstrates, I think, how much ritual authority the Broadway Tevye has come to command. For example, in this advertisement for a funeral home, which I know is a little bit hard to read, but basically what the text says is, I've played the role of Tevye on stage thousands of times, so I am authorized to tell you that this funeral home is halachically correct. And then Fiddler's songs, of course, have made their way into Jewish and other ritual observance. For decades, the waltz, Sunrise Sunset, was obligatory at weddings for its universal expression of parents watching children growing up too fast. Even today, the song remains a recommended favorite. The website Bridal Guide suggests it as a perfect number for a father-daughter dance. This is not a huge departure, perhaps, from the trend of songs from Broadway becoming popular hits before the explosion of rock and roll took over the pop charts. And the Beatles, by the way, made their U.S. premiere on The Ed Sullivan Show in February of 1964, just about 6 months before Edie Gourmet would sing Sunrise Sunset on that same program. More significant in the folklorization process, I think, is the song Sabbath Prayer, a tune that represented what in 1964 was a very bold move for a Broadway musical, coming just a few scenes into the show. Tevye and his family and their guests gather around the Shabbos table, and though in a Broadwayized version, silently enact the rituals, candle lighting, kiddush, motzi. And then, in song adapted from the liturgy, the parents' blessing of the children. A song I learned from my niece, who went to Jewish summer camp, is used these days as as part of Sabbath observance at summer camps. On stage, the song hailed Jews specifically into community. The set designer Boris Aronson, who was from Kiev, had to start in the Yiddish theater. That's a whole other story we don't have time for today. But in any case, Boris Aronson had painted a scrim as the backdrop to Tevye's home, and when it was lit from behind, it became translucent, revealing families in various places all over Anatevka and metaphorically all over the world, enacting the same ritual and binding themselves to each other and their shared history. Indeed, Sabbath Prayer was one of the first songs Bach and Harnick wrote as they got started working on the show, and it established an important motif in the score. For starters, the repeated use of the interval of the fourth with its deep liturgical echoes. May the Lord protect, matchmaker, matchmaker, tradition, Chavarai Nevarech, Baruch atah Adonai, Baruch hu Adonai Hamvarach, and almost every other melody in Jewish liturgy. Of course, sociologists already knew in 1964 that the vast majority of American Jews did not observe the Sabbath. Fiedler offered them a very secular way of guarding and remembering it. This showbiz depiction made room for even the most secular and assimilated of Jews to appreciate and even claim the beauty of Jewish practice. Most important for the director Jerry Robbins, and the best proof text perhaps for my argument today, was what happened when he went out to do research to create the dances. He hired as a dance research consultant a woman named Devorah Lapson, an expert in Jewish dance who brokered Robbins' entree into Orthodox celebrations. Robbins reached her in the fall of 1963 through the Jewish Education Committee, and his timing couldn't have been better. Simchas Torah was coming up, and Lapson knew of a shtibel where this ecstatic holiday would be celebrated with special abandon. Robbins attended, bringing along Bach, Harnick, and Stein, and dozens of men crammed into the tiny shtibel, singing, clapping, knocking back schnapps after schnapps after schnapps after schnapps. The dancing came as a revelation. The secular showmen expected gentle folk forms, moseying around a circle. Instead, they felt the room shake from floor stomping, body twisting, athletic flinging, and writhing. Then Devorah Lapson scored some invitations for Hasidic weddings. Once again, the dancing enthralled Jerry Robbins with what he came to call its virile ferocity. And he couldn't get enough. He attended one wedding after another, and every time he was amazed by the dancing. In handwritten notes I found in his archive, he marveled. My great wonder watching the dancers was how people weren't hurt and bruised as bodies were flung centrifugally from out-of-control circles. Hats flew off, chairs overturned. But the rough, dominant force that was released by all this kinetic energy was overpowering. Two things held them together. Their constant hand grip, when if broken by the external momentum of the dance or by another body flinging itself into the dancer, was always regained, reunited. And secondly, the deep and powerful assertion, a strength I never knew, a dedication to a right claiming survival and joy, procreation and celebration, an explosive foot thrust to the floor that shook the room that said, yes, I am here, and I celebrate the continuity of my existence. And this is remarkable, and we don't have time for this either, but given that Robbins was quite alienated from his Jewish identity pretty much up until this point in his life, this is a remarkable response. Something else intrigued him too. A man with a rusty beard who seemed to be a regular at these weddings, entertaining the guests by weaving among them with a particular trick. Devorah Lapson had seen such antics during her research in Europe, and she told Robbins that this man was performing a Flaschentanz, a caper in which she said, quote, the man balances a bottle on his head as he dances, perhaps to prove himself sober. The image lodged itself in Robbins's imagination. And then it simmered there, eventually to be transformed by his artistry, high emotion, and theatrical showmanship. It's impossible to know exactly and minutely what moves Robbins took from the frolics of the Flaschentanzer or from the communal cavorting among the men at Orthodox weddings, but there's no doubt that Robbins embellished on what he observed. About a dozen years earlier, when choreographing Small House of Uncle Thomas, the play within the play for The King and I, Robbins hit a dead end as he was trying to create authentic Siamese dance, despite his extensive research into the genre. It was... There we go. And, Yoni, could you turn it down a little, please? was only when Richard Rogers urged him to take some license with the movement vocabulary that Robbins was able to break through his inhibition and devise an exciting 14-minute dance drama that conveyed Siameseness with its cocked legs, flexed feet and wrists, and wide stance demi-pliés, but that borrowed from Balinese Lagong dance, Peking opera, Japanese kabuki, and as well as from Martha Graham, and most of all important, from Robbins' own imagination. Excited as Robbins had been by the dancing he'd seen at weddings, he showed no signs of using that research in the show. He didn't mention it in any production meetings that were held in the spring of 1964 in New York. He didn't bring it up in the first rehearsals that summer in New York, nor when the show went on the road for tryouts, first to Detroit, and not even in the early days of Washington, the second city in the on-the-road tryouts. Then one morning, about a week into the Washington run, after the local reviewers had declared Fiddler on the Roof a triumph, Robbins called a rehearsal of the male dance corps at 10 o'clock in the morning in the theater lobby. The men had no idea why he wanted them there. Many who did not have demanding parts in the L'Chaim number from the first act had long figured that nothing taxing was being asked of them, and they'd stopped keeping up a daily workout routine. Robbins didn't say much by way of explanation when the dozen men assembled. He showed the troupe some steps, walking in a circle with some bounce in the knees to begin, and then, well, let's just say that the reason the rehearsal was held in the lobby was that the lobby was carpeted, and Robbins knew that some bottles would be crashing to the floor. He taught the troupe the move in a few hours' time. And then he called a put-in rehearsal for later that afternoon. The entire cast played through the wedding scene, and the cast burst into applause, and some burst into tears when they saw the new number for the first time. That very night, it went into the show, and it has brought the house down ever since. Here is Robbins' choreographic genius radiantly on display. 2.5 riveting minutes of innovative movement that reveal the situation, feed the action, and in its very form encapsulate the show's ideals of Jewish revivification and cultural adaptation. Legendarily, the set designer Boris Aronson, who'd been driven up the wall by the way Robbins constantly changed his mind about the scenery, telling him to, put the moon 2 inches higher today, and no, move it back tomorrow. Aronson watched from the back of the house the first night the bottle dance went into the show. At the close of the dance, he turned to Robbins' assistant, Richard Altman, and said, "Any man who can do that, I forgive everything." The bottle dance embodies Fiddler's essential gesture by expressing what looks like religious folk form within the idiom of a Broadway showstopper. And hear how the music builds here. And this part, by the way, the dancers I interviewed from the original show told me is much harder to do than balancing the bottles. And the bottles, they don't use any Velcro or any tricks either. So you'll see in a moment, the camera cuts away before you see the choreography's final pose. But it's the quintessential footlight finish. Down on one knee, arms spread wide, chest thrust forward. Kind of like Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer, that other Rabinowitz who changed his name to Robin when he went into show business. And you can't be any more razzmatazz than this. Here it comes. Okay. That's what they do there. And this could be the end of the story, insofar as the last rehearsals in Washington reshaped the show for better and forever. But something so much larger happened with the bottle dance, and it's an emblem of Fiddler's own function of providing a usable ethnic past to Americans in the 21st century. Through Robbins' genius, popular culture, as so often happens, absorbed and remade an element of presumed folk culture, and then, amazingly, returned it to the folk, who take it up as their own authentic expression. Just as Sholem Aleichem's lullaby, Schlaf mein Kind, became an anonymous folk tune, the choreography Robbins made up becomes, as you'll hear called in a moment, an age-old magnificent dance, and a means of bringing Jewish tradition into a bar mitzvah, as if the bar mitzvah itself were not sufficient to that purpose. And I'm about to show you an actual commercial. Yeah, can we have the volume up, please?
Congratulations, you're planning a simcha, a wedding, a bar, a bat mitzvah, a 50th wedding anniversary. Now that's cause for a celebration. Obviously, you would love for your party to be something wonderful, something special and unique, not the same old, same old. Every one of the appearances of the amazing bottle dancers is indeed something wonderful and truly unique. What you're about to see will be that special something, the highlight that you and your guests will always remember.
Shmuel, Nachum, Evram, Moshe, if you have Maddie, bring her in!
Note the music.
But wait, there's more. The rabbis go out into the audience, getting everyone up for a horror that no one will soon forget, featuring authentic klezmer music. So whether it's a birthday, anniversary, temple banquet or installation, Hanukkah party at your home, a black tie wedding or one in the backyard, a bar or bat mitzvah, the amazing bottle dancers is special for everyone, kids and adults. Hey, you don't even have to be Jewish to appreciate the humor, the tradition of this age-old, magnificent dance. And speaking of tradition, no matter how contemporary your simcha is, a little tradition never hurt.
So, Sholem Aleichem, of course, did enjoy one smash theatrical success in his lifetime. It was his first major foray into the theater, Tzeit and Shespreit, which opened at the Elysium Theater in Warsaw in the spring of 1905. At the urging of the producer and translator, Mark Arnstein, Sholem Aleichem traveled from his home in Kiev at the time to Warsaw for the premiere. "What shall I write you about yesterday's triumph?" Sholem Aleichem asked his daughter in a letter that he sent the day after he saw the show. In ecstatic detail, he described how the audience, quote, literally covered me with flowers after the first act, and how after every act that followed, they called him to the stage repeatedly. To avoid the clamoring thongs who were going to rush him at the end of the play, he hid in a locked loge for half an hour and then slipped out a back door. With more prescience than he could have guessed, Sholem Aleichem concluded his letter thus: "My fate and your future, I mean that of my successors, are tightly bound up with the Jewish theater. Write it down in your calendar." While Sholem Aleichem's daughter would have done well to mark a date more than half a century later that would not only forever tie Sholem Aleichem's fate to the theater, but also shape the future of remembered Jewish history until now. September 22nd, 1964, the opening night of Fiddler on the Roof.
Well, thank you. I have a little bit to add. We've seen how Sholem Aleichem came to New York. We see how Sholem Aleichem made his way into kitsch. both in Ukraine and in America, how this embodiment of tradition then became used in some way to destroy tradition. But one thing that is interesting is, how did Sholem Aleichem come into the work of a writer who is the opposite of kitsch, who is the embodiment of literary tradition, who is the embodiment of literary conscience and history, Philip Roth? How did that happen? Philip Roth, who has made no secret of the fact that he neither likes Sholem Aleichem's work nor would ever read it. Philip Roth, who prides himself on having come from a Yiddish-speaking family, but would never speak Yiddish. There are bits and pieces of it in his novels. And it comes into his work unconsciously through what I think we might be able to call an authentic tradition. A tradition that does not make its way into the bar mitzvahs or the b'nai mitzvahs. A tradition that is somewhere in the collective consciousness of the Jewish people, perhaps. And by doing so, it establishes not an influence and not a direct connection, but it establishes a family of values, which I think is a very important way of thinking about the continuity of Jewish literature. Literature that is being written and has been written since the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century in many different languages, by Jews who, in some cases, observe rituals and tradition, and in other cases, by those who profess agnosticism, by those who want nothing whatsoever to do with their own people, like Philip Roth, apparently. And I want to read a couple of excerpts from Sholem Aleichem, a couple of his works, and Isaac Babel, because the key to this is Isaac Babel. When I was in Moscow a few years ago, I was treated to a performance of his play, Ben Yakrik. And lo and behold, the background music for Ben Yakrik by Isaac Babel was from Fiddler on the Roof. And I said to my friend, how is this possible that they could be playing Fiddler on the Roof as background music to Ben Yakrik? And she said, oh, no, this isn't Fiddler on the Roof. These are traditional Jewish folk melodies. So the same thing that has happened here happened over there. Babel, Isaac Babel, as we know and as we've heard, loved Sholem Aleichem. He edited Sholem Aleichem's work, but more than that, he even translated Sholem Aleichem's writings into Russian. Babel was fluent in Hebrew and Yiddish, and he wrote in Russian when a lot of his colleagues from Odessa and elsewhere chose to write in Yiddish. Isaac Babel wanted to be a Russian writer. He wanted to be accepted as a Russian writer in the tradition of the great Russian novelist. And yet, as Kurt Levien and others have said, it is most evident in the Odessa stories the profound influence on him of Sholem Aleichem. But there are other influences and other affinities between Babel and Sholem Aleichem, and I believe this set of quotations makes it clear. This is from a story called A Daughter's Grave by Sholem Aleichem. You're on your way to the fair, and we're coming home from the fair. I have done my weeping already, and you're still going to weep. So let me make room for you. Here, move a little closer. In your heart, you feel autumn, and you're longing for home. In your heart, you feel autumn, not winter. You feel autumn. You feel the anticipation of loss, not loss itself, but you know that loss is there on the horizon of your world and your experience. And in How It Is Done in Odessa, by Isaac Babel, the wise old gangster is telling the young gangster, well then, forget for a while that you have glasses on your nose and autumn in your heart. You're a tiger, you're a lion, you're a cat. You can spend the night with a Russian woman, and the Russian woman will be satisfied by you. You're 25 years old, and you want to bring heaven down to earth. But the story ends by this same old gangster saying to his young colleague, but what use is it if you still have glasses on your nose and autumn in your heart? In Philip Roth's novel, I believe it's 1979, The Ghostwriter, one of the most brilliant and perfect of his works, there is a young writer, sort of like the young gangster in How It Is Done in Odessa, who goes to the older writer for advice, sort of like the old gangster in the story. And they're talking about literature, and they're talking about how one conceives of oneself as a Jewish writer in Goyish America. And the young man, Nathan Zuckerman, says, well, connected, of course, isn't the right word. Neither is influence. It's family resemblance that I'm talking about. It's as though, as I see it, you are Babel's American cousin. It's Babel's fascination with big-time Jews, with conscienceless Cossacks, with everyone who has it his own way. The will is the big idea. And Lanov, the older writer, says to him, and what about you? Zuckerman says, me. And Lanov says, aren't you a New World cousin in the Babel clan too? What is Zuckerman in all of this? And then Nathan thinks to himself, because he's clever, he says, but Lanov had read my designing mind all right, for when I came upon Babel's description of the Jewish writer as a man with autumn in his heart and spectacles on his nose, I had been inspired to add, and blood, and I will expurgate this, Bowdlerize it a little bit, blood in his veins. You can imagine what part of the anatomy the blood flows in. And had then recorded the words like a challenge, a flaming Daedalian formula to ignite my soul's smithy. Autumn in the heart, spectacles on the nose, and blood soaring in one's veins is the formula for Nathan Zuckerman becoming a Jewish American writer. When I suggested to Roth a couple of years ago that he was quoting Sholem Aleichem, he absolutely denied this. He had never read the story, A Daughter's Grave. But the concept of autumn in the heart resonated with him as it resonates in the world of Nathan Zuckerman, who writes an invented life of Anne Frank. That is his spiritual journey, to recover the life of Anne Frank with its inevitable loss, its inevitable grief, and it's the inevitability of it. But yet you have spectacles on your nose. What are those spectacles for, after all? They're for seeing, they're for vision, they're for ensuring an integrity of vision, of seeing the truth. And the truth, it turns out, is something that Nathan Zuckerman's family absolutely doesn't want him to tell about his family. Because why does anybody have to hear the truth? It's better to hear what you just saw, tradition. It's better to hear a mindsie instead of the truth, besides which the Goyim will make heyday out of this, and they'll see that Jews are fighting over money, and they'll see that they hate each other, and they kick each other out of each other's house. So what do we need it for? It's a shanda for the Goyim. And he gets into trouble with his father. And his father advises him to go see Judge Wachter, who will straighten him out. But this combination of vision and loss and the blood that's soaring through his veins is what is important for Philip Roth. It's a powerful and dazzling formula for being a writer. Concretely, I will give you another set of quotations. In A Daughter's Grave, the parent says, an only child, gifted and beautiful, a high school graduate. And then in From the Fair, the memoir that we've heard about, was there a connection between fiddling and knowledge? Well, there was a connection. In those days, the violin played an honorable role in the program of knowledge. You had to know everything. You had to know everything. And then later, when the young Sholem Aleichem is with a shyster who's trying to make him successful in life, he's given this bit of advice. Don't dare let a client slip out of your hands until you've squeezed him dry. And remember, there is nothing under the sun to which you'll admit, I don't know, because you know everything. Isaac Babel writes a beautiful little story called Sabbath with Grandmother. And in that story, he writes, on Sabbaths after 6 classes, I came home late. Sorokin, his violin teacher, had come. I hated him at that moment. I hated the scales, the incomprehensible, pointless, shrill music. And so he, like the young Sholem Aleichem, is being forced to learn the violin. Study, his grandmother says, suddenly and forcefully. Study, and you can have everything, wealth and glory. You must know everything. Everyone will fall on their knees before you and bow to you. Let them envy you. Don't believe in people. Don't have friends. Don't give them your money. Don't give them your heart. The grandmother's advice. You must know everything. Nathan Zuckerman, who's just starting his career in Philip Roth's novel, has written this story. And guess what? The story is called Higher Education. And it's about his family and the feud that drives the family apart. And it's too much reality for his family to take. And his father admonishes him, accuses him of concentrating solely on the derelict uncle and not on all the love and care other family members show. His exasperated father finally tells them, they don't think about, the readers out there, they don't think about how it's a great work of art. They don't know about art. People don't read art. They read about people. They read about people. Later, after Nathan has completed his imaginary recreation of Anne Frank and comes back to the reality of being with Lanoff in his house, they have a conversation, and he ends the novel by saying, But what do I know other than what I can imagine? And so the knowledge that you must have is not only the knowledge of things, it's the knowledge that your imagination gives you. It is the integrity of an imaginative world that was vital for Sholem Aleichem, it was vital for Isaac Babel, and it is the core of Philip Roth's whole literary life. To be true to that. And that is what, strangely, inexplicably, binds this great American writer who, for many years, wanted very little to do with the Jewish world, though wrote ceaselessly about it. And this writer, whose laughter and sweet ironies and ironic sweetness has lifted the spirits of the Jewish people for 100 years and more. Roth rejected Sholem Aleichem because of his perceived sentimentalism, the nostalgia his work evoked for a lost world. But he divined in that passage from Isaac Babel's story, How Is It Done in Odessa, the inner spirit which would propel his own. The novel is entitled The Ghostwriter, in which this spirit makes its most prominent entry. And in that novel, the ghostwriter is Nathan Zuckerman, who rewrites the life of Anne Frank. But perhaps in a larger, deeper, more mysterious sense, the ghostwriter is actually Sholem Aleichem, who is now revealing a side to himself and a side to his sensibility that is often lost in the jokes or not seen in the jokes and the irony. Roth said a couple of years ago that he thought he had been born in Newark, New Jersey, which is where his hero, Nathan Zuckerman, is born. But he said now he realizes it's a much bigger story. And that's the story that he couldn't tell by himself. Thank you. And now Yevgeny Kisen is going to recite a poem, Sholem Aleichem auf Russisch.
Dear friends, you saw during David Fishman's lecture the Soviet edition of Sholem Aleicham's works in Russian, those 6 brown books. So I'll recite my poem about how I read them as a teenager and what they became for me. Täfelich bräune und Seiten ein bisschen vergällte, 6 dicke Bänder, auf jeden mit russische Äußers, Wörter, was pflegen schon dann, a so lieb vor mir äußern und klingen, Sholem Aleichem. Ich pflege als der Wachsling sich eintunken in jene Seiten, und sehr reich vor mir es gewinn wie der Duft von dem Städtel, wie der Geruch von einem jüdischen Leben dem Alten, pflegen bis gar mich verhaben die alle Gestalten, Stamping, Rochele, Jossele, Esther, schöne Musik, aber Unglücken Liebe. Darum der niedlicher Luftmensch mit sein schöner Schändel und mit sein ewigen Iker Schochachti, der wie der Milchiker, wie ein grobstammiger Dämp, goldes Herze, Seine Töchter gerotene, kluge und schöne, mit allen Männern, was sie haben sich ausgeklieben. Und ich pfleg sich auslernen jüdische Wörter dort in die Heores. Freund, Golinar, Balabessel, das polische Jingel, Wecker, Lechlecho, das jüdische Volk, Kolme Wasser. Jüdische Wörter mit russischen Äußers gedruckte. Ich hab sich von dorten der Wust das Sach nehmen von Jiden berühmte, Mendele, Dubnov, Straschunski, Jehoinen Hassandler, Goldfaden, Bialik, Rambam, Chaim Selig Sloninski. 6 bräune Bänder, von welcher amol ich hab genossen, mein ersten Tamm von ein Stück jüdisch Leben. Seinen sie mein erster Fenster geworden in der unendlicher Zauberwelt von unser Ruhme Jerusche, was mein ganz Leben wird sein nicht genug zu benennen. Öffne ich auf sehr Zind und der Schmeck sehr recht dem Alten. Lehne ein bisschen und durch sich mir, als hotsch mit russischen Wörtern, ist es auf etwas in jüdischer Sprache angeschrieben. Öffnet sich auf ein Stück jüdische Welt auf das Nei, vor die Augen und vor den Herzen, geliebter und leiblicher Shalom Aleichem.
So this concludes our program. I want to say a couple of words more. First, I want to thank Alex Weiser for organizing all of this, and I want very much to thank our entire archive and Lyudmila Sholachova, head of our archives, and Eddie Portnoy for the extraordinary exhibition, which I urge you to see upstairs on the 3rd floor. It includes photos from the estate of Belle Kaufman, donated by her children, Thea Goldstein and John Goldstein, who are with us today. And now, please enjoy the refreshments, and please become a member of YIVO if you are not already. Thank you.